Beneath the dazzling lights of old Hollywood, the red carpets, the polished tuxedos, the flawless close-ups, lurked a truth far less glamorous. Behind the camera, some of the industry's most iconic legends carried secrets no perfume could mask. They captivated the world with their charm, talent, and screen presence, but off-screen, they left behind a trail of scandalous smells, unwashed costumes, and horror stories from cast and crew alike. This is the untold, unfiltered side of classic Hollywood, the stars who reigned supreme but reeked behind the scenes. Welcome to the dirtiest secrets of cinema's golden age. Clark Gable, the king with killer breath. Clark Gable, the silver screen's leading man. The one who lit up every frame with a smirk, a swagger, and that unmistakable old-school charm. But while millions of moviegoers swooned from their seats, those working next to him on set had a very different experience, especially anyone within kissing distance. Vivien Leigh, his Gone with the Wind co-star, was one of the first to pull back the curtain. The famous kiss between Rhett and Scarlett? She hated filming it. Not because she disliked him. He was, after all, Clark Gable, but because of the smell. Gable's breath was the stuff of legend, and not in a good way. He had all his teeth pulled in his early 30s, the result of years of dental neglect, and wore dentures for most of his career. Dental hygiene in the 1930s wasn't exactly high-tech, and those false teeth came with a funk that no amount of breath mints could fix. Crew members joked that he could melt the lens off a camera. And his hygiene didn't stop at the mouth. Gable was known to sweat a lot. Add hot studio lights, heavy suits, and the pressure of big-budget productions, and the man was practically a walking sauna. Soap and deodorant were optional. Cologne? A last-minute cover-up. Still, he was untouchable in Hollywood, proof that charisma can overpower almost anything. But if you were close enough to feel his presence, you probably smelled it first. Errol Flynn, the swaggering storm of stench. Errol Flynn didn't walk onto a set, he arrived, like a hurricane in a tuxedo. Swashbuckling, womanizing, and constantly teetering between brilliance and chaos, Flynn was the original bad boy of Hollywood. And let's be clear, he didn't smell like roses blowing in with the wind. More like whiskey, musk, and last week's regrets. From Captain Blood to the adventures of Robin Hood, Flynn owned the screen. But behind the scenes, the man was feral. He bathed infrequently, wore clothes until they practically peeled themselves off his body, and thought hygiene was a suggestion, not a necessity. Co-stars said you could smell him before you saw him. His body odor was part of the package, and not the charming part. He lived in a mansion he dubbed the House of Scandal, which was less a home and more a den of unwashed sheets, spilled liquor, and unchecked chaos. He reportedly kept the same stained robe for days, refused to clean up after his wild parties, and rarely changed his bedding. His personal yacht was said to reek of body odor and gin. Guests came aboard and left with a memory and a mild infection. But here's the thing. None of it slowed him down. Women still chased him. Studios still hired him. He had the kind of raw charisma that made producers look past the smell and directors overlook the mess. Errol Flynn didn't care what you thought. He was too busy being infamous. And stinky. Always stinky. Marlon Brando, the method and the musk. Marlon Brando didn't just act, he became. Every gesture, every stare, every line delivered like a secret. He changed the game, set the standard, and made acting dangerous in the best way. But while Brando was reinventing cinema, he was also quietly reinventing what it meant to be ripe. Co-stars described him as brilliant, difficult, and, frankly, smelly. During The Godfather, he was known to show up barefoot, shirtless, and reeking of whatever he had eaten, smoked, or sweated through the day before. One makeup artist said his smell had texture. Not a compliment. Brando had a stubborn disregard for anything that resembled grooming. He'd often refuse to shower, skip deodorant entirely, and wear the same clothes multiple days in a row, sometimes inside out. There are stories of him arriving on set with food stains on his shirt, no socks, and a cloud of body odor trailing behind, like a second costume. And it wasn't just his body. He reportedly didn't like brushing his teeth and would snack between takes, garlic, onions, strong cheese, anything that left a lasting impression on whoever was unlucky enough to be standing in close range. Leading ladies dreaded kissing scenes. Some said it felt like kissing a man who had just finished lunch in a closet. But here's the thing about Brando, he knew he could get away with it. When you're the most talented man in the room, people put up with a lot. And they did. Because when the camera rolled, all that stink, it vanished. What was left was legend. Spencer Tracy, the grime behind the gravitas. Spencer Tracy was the kind of actor who made everything look effortless. Stoic, grounded, intense, you believed every word he said. He wasn't flashy like Gable or wild like Flynn, but there was a quiet power in him that made directors lean in and audiences listen. And while the studios carefully crafted his image as the dependable everyman, those who worked with him knew another side. Spencer Tracy had a long-running reputation for neglecting personal hygiene. Not in a shocking, headline-grabbing way, but in that slow, creeping kind of way where, after a few hours on set, people started stepping back just a little farther. He was a heavy drinker and a lifelong smoker, and the combination stuck to him like a second skin. His clothes often carried the stale scent of cigarettes and yesterday's whiskey, even before lunch. Makeup artists sometimes had to deal with unwashed skin. Wardrobe had to work around body odors soaked into suits. And co-stars? They learned to breathe through their mouths when things got close. He was known to wear the same underclothes for multiple days on long shoots, and once he was in character, good luck convincing him to shower. It was almost part of his process. Get into the grime, live in it, be the character. And yet, like the others, none of it stuck to his career. Tracy kept getting top billing, kept winning awards, kept commanding every frame he was in. Because once the lights went up, all anyone saw was brilliance. But those who got close, they remembered the smell. Humphrey Bogart, the smoker who stank up the set. Humphrey Bogart was the definition of cool. Fedora tilted just right, cigarette dangling from his lip, voice like gravel in a whiskey glass. Whether he was gunning down gangsters or breaking hearts in Casablanca, Bogart had that rare mix of toughness and vulnerability that made him unforgettable. But off camera, there was nothing cool about the smell. Bogart was a chain smoker, not in the casual, few-a-day kind of way. We're talking pack after pack, back to back, all day long. Some days, he was rarely seen without a cigarette either in hand or lit somewhere nearby. His clothes reeked of smoke. His fingers were stained yellow. His breath? Let's just say it didn't exactly invite intimacy. Lauren Bacall, his iconic on-screen and off-screen partner, once joked that kissing Bogart was like kissing an ashtray. And she loved the man. Imagine how the crew felt, spending 12-hour days in tight shooting spaces with a guy puffing constantly. His trailer smelled like a cigar lounge with the windows sealed shut. Props, costumes, even scripts, everything around him carried that heavy, stale scent of nicotine and sweat. And hygiene-wise, let's just say personal grooming was second to his vices. Bathing was done eventually. Changing clothes? When necessary. He wasn't sloppy, but he wasn't exactly fresh either. He leaned into the grit, let it become part of who he was. But here's the catch, it worked. That rough around the edges smell, that lived-in look, it wasn't an act. It was Bogart. He didn't pretend to be clean-cut. He was the smoke, the stubble, the stench, and audiences loved every second of it. Montgomery Clift, the beautiful mess. Montgomery Clift was the kind of actor who didn't act. He bled on camera. Vulnerable, haunted, achingly real. He wasn't just handsome. He was soulful, intense, and aching with something no one could quite name. But behind that piercing stare was a man who, as his life unraveled, started letting go of more than just a sense of purpose. He let go of basic hygiene. Early in his career, Clift was known for his quiet elegance. Clean cut, sharp dresser. But after a near-fatal car crash in 1956 that shattered his face and spirit, things changed. He became withdrawn, erratic, and increasingly indifferent to how he looked, smelled, or appeared in public. He'd show up on set unshaven, wearing the same shirt 3 days in a row, his hair uncombed, breath sour from whatever pills or drinks had gotten him through the night. Makeup teams had their work cut out for them, literally. Some days, they had to layer on powder just to mask the sweat and odor. His once pristine suits started to look like thrift store leftovers. Crew members said he'd often skip showers for days, and there were whispers that even basic grooming, like brushing his teeth or changing socks, became optional. And yet, even as he fell apart physically, the camera loved him. That raw pain, the edge of desperation, the sense that he was barely holding it together, that's what made his performances unforgettable. But the people working closest to him, they saw more than the art. They saw the mess. And they smelled it, too. Robert Mitchum, the dirtbag you couldn't look away from. Robert Mitchum didn't play by the rules. He barely acknowledged they existed. Whether he was playing a drifting antihero or straight-up villain, Mitchum had that effortless swagger that made him impossible to ignore. But while his on-screen presence was smooth, his personal hygiene, that was rough, raw, and proudly ignored. Mitchum was the kind of guy who could walk onto a $1 million set looking like he'd just slept in a train station, and half the time, he had. He'd show up to shoots unshaven, still wearing the same shirt from the day before, sometimes smelling like he'd just rolled out of a dive bar and straight into the scene. And that's because he had. He openly admitted that grooming wasn't a priority. He hated Hollywood pretension, and he made it known. No cologne, no fancy skincare, no interest in playing clean-cut for the cameras. Co-stars said his odor was earthy, which is a polite way of saying ripe. He'd sometimes film entire days without a shower, especially on location shoots where he could blend into the dirt and dust. He once joked, "I keep my smell authentic, like my acting." Wardrobe tried. Makeup tried. Even the director would try nudging him toward a clean-up, but Mitchum couldn't be bothered. He wasn't being lazy. He was making a point. Hollywood polish wasn't his style. If he reeked a little, well, that was just part of the deal. And guess what? It worked. Because Robert Mitchum didn't need to be clean to be cool. He just had to show up, squint at the camera, and say the line like he didn't give a damn. And he didn't. Peter Lorre, the smell of suspicion. Peter Lorre was the human question mark. Bug-eyed, whisper-voiced, always looking like he knew something you didn't. From M to the Maltese Falcon, he brought an eerie charisma that made him unforgettable. But for those who shared a soundstage or dressing room, the memory came with a bit of a stench. Lorre didn't exactly value cleanliness. He was eccentric private and often so locked into his characters that personal grooming seemed to fall off the to-do list entirely. He had a reputation for showing up to set unwashed, with hair flattened by old sweat and breath that could make an extra flinch on cue. Some cast members swore he wore the same undershirt for entire productions, whether he was filming, rehearsing, or just lurking behind the camera. It didn't help that he smoked constantly and was reportedly addicted to painkillers for a time, which gave him a slightly sickly, medicinal smell. Not rotting or offensive, but off. Like something faintly spoiled, mixed with mothballs and stale coffee. One studio insider once described Lorre as a brilliant little ghost who forgot he had a body. Makeup crews would powder his forehead and try to manage the shine, but nothing could mask the deeper issue. The smell wasn't from sweat alone. It was the scent of someone who lived more in his head than his skin. The kind of person who forgot the basics because he was too busy being haunted by every role he played. Still, he always delivered. He might have made people wince when he walked by, but once that camera rolled, nobody blinked. Because Peter Lorre, even at his smelliest, was magnetic. Wallace Beery, the ogre of the soundstage. Wallace Beery was a box office giant in his day, big name, big roles, big personality. But behind the scenes, the word most often used to describe him wasn't star. It was disgusting. Beery had the kind of presence that filled a room, and the kind of smell that cleared it out just as fast. He was known throughout Hollywood as difficult, crude, and flat-out unpleasant. And we're not just talking about personality. Beery had a long-standing aversion to soap, clean clothes, and anything resembling personal care. Rumor had it he'd wear the same undershirt for a week, sweat through it, then just flip it inside out, and keep going. He rarely brushed his teeth, even on days when he had close-up scenes, and his breath reportedly had the punch of old meat left in the sun. Co-stars dreaded working with him. He'd show up late, unwashed, belching openly, sometimes farting during scenes just to throw people off. One actress called him a walking barnyard. Directors had to structure shots to avoid putting other actors too close to him. He was the kind of guy who thought deodorant was for sissies, and that being gross made him more real. And yet, he kept working. Audiences loved him for his gruff, grizzled charm. But no one on set mistook it for an act. Wallace Beery wasn't playing the slob, he was the slob. Loud, foul, and proud of it. He didn't just leave an impression, he left a smell trail. W.C. Fields, the man who feared water more than critics. W.C. Fields didn't care what you thought of him, and he made sure you knew it. With his bulbous nose, biting wit, and constant glass of apple juice, spoiler, it wasn't apple juice, he built an image of a boozy curmudgeon. But here's the thing, that image wasn't a character. That was Fields, unfiltered, unwashed, and unbothered. This was a man who famously claimed to be allergic to soap. And not as a joke, he meant it. He hated bathing, hated washing his face, and reportedly avoided water altogether unless it was in a highball glass. His skin often had a strange sheen, part sweat, part who knows what, and the red hue of someone who spent more time marinating in gin than taking a shower. Crew members said you could smell him before you heard his gravelly voice. His suits were wrinkled, his breath reeked of rotgut booze, and his body odor was theatrical. People learned to keep their distance, not because he was famous, but because getting too close was like walking into a fog of stale alcohol and last week's sweat. His home reportedly smelled like a cocktail napkin left in a gutter. And that's not a metaphor. He surrounded himself with liquor bottles, cigarette ash, and layers of dust so thick they practically qualified as roommates. But here's what's wild. None of it seemed to matter. W.C. Fields could shuffle onto a set stinking to high heaven, nail his scene, and shuffle off without ever breaking a sweat or touching a bar of soap. He was filthy, foul-tempered, and often drunk, but he was funny. And in the end, that was all the studio cared about. Charles Laughton, the genius who didn't wash away the role. Charles Laughton didn't just play characters, he consumed them. Whether he was commanding a courtroom, a battlefield, or a haunted house, he was all in every time. But the same obsessive immersion that made him one of the most powerful actors of his era also had a dark side. Because when Laughton dove into a role, he didn't just lose himself, he sometimes lost track of basic hygiene. He was known to show up to set in disarray, unwashed, sleep-deprived, and smelling like a man who hadn't left his dressing gown or his apartment for a few days. His body odor wasn't aggressive so much as persistent. A slow, damp mustiness that crept up on you, like mildew in an opera cape. Laughton was incredibly self-conscious about his appearance, and it fed into his eccentric grooming habits. He would sometimes refuse to take off certain garments for days, especially if he thought they helped him stay in character. Crew members joked that his costumes had more acting experience than some of the extras because he lived in them, sweated through them, slept in them, and while he wasn't exactly hostile, he could be cold and closed off, wrapped up in his own brilliance. The result? People hesitated to tell him the obvious. He needed a wash. Or at the very least, a change of shirt. He had a habit of muttering to himself between takes, pacing, sweating, whispering lines, completely unaware that the cloud around him wasn't just theatrical tension. It was him. But when the camera rolled, he exploded into life. Raw, vulnerable, terrifying. You forgot the smell. You forgot the sweat. You only saw greatness. Just don't sit next to it. Bela Lugosi, the phantom who forgot to freshen up. Bela Lugosi didn't play Dracula, he became him. That accent, that stare, that slow, deliberate presence, it hypnotized a generation. But the dark elegance he brought to the screen came with something else behind the scenes, a creeping, musty odor that followed him like a curse. In his prime, Lugosi was a sharp dresser and carried himself like royalty. But as the years wore on and the roles dried up, so did his attention to personal care. Colleagues from his later films whispered that he began to show up disheveled, unwashed, with costumes stained not just by stage makeup, but by sweat and neglect. His Dracula cape? Legendary. But rumor has it, that thing could have walked onto set by itself. Makeup artists struggled to mask the smell of stale sweat and mothballs. His breath was described as chemical, a mix of cigarettes, whatever medication he was on that day, and a diet that seemed to consist mainly of black coffee and desperation. He'd sweat under the lights, badly, and didn't always bring a fresh change of wardrobe. Or socks. Or anything really. What made it worse was that he still carried himself like a gothic prince. Regal posture, theatrical gestures, intense eye contact, right up until you got close enough to realize Dracula could probably use a sponge bath. But even in his decline, when the hygiene dipped and the cape smelled like a crypt, Lugosi still had that spark. That tragic, commanding presence. He was spooky, he was sad, and he definitely smelled like the dead. Lon Chaney Jr., the wolfman who reeked between takes. Lon Chaney Jr. had some big shoes to fill. His father was known as the man of 1,000 faces. And while Jr. didn't quite match his father's range, he carved out his legacy by becoming the tortured, tragic face of Universal's classic monsters. But behind the fur, fangs, and makeup, there was another legacy brewing, one of pure, undiluted stink. Playing monsters wasn't glamorous. Especially in the 1940s, when studio makeup meant sitting under hot lights for hours while artists slathered layers of latex, glue, and yak hair onto your face. Chaney Jr. endured all, but he rarely cleaned up between takes. Or after them. He'd show up to work already sweating, get baked under prosthetics for 10 hours, then peel it off and head home without so much as a rinse. The result? A smell that was part man, part monster. Colleagues said his Wolfman costume had to be aired out overnight and still came back damp. His body odor was described as sour and meaty, like something left too long in a costume trunk. One poor soul in the makeup department claimed that by week 2 of filming, they were applying glue while holding their breath. And it wasn't just the monster gigs. Even in roles that didn't require fur and fangs, Chaney often showed up grungy. Rumpled shirts, food-stained cuffs, and breath that hinted at last night's liquor, probably still sitting in his gut. Still, there was a charm to him. A sadness, too. He played monsters like a man who understood them, and maybe that's why no one ever told him to take a shower. You don't lecture Frankenstein about deodorant. You just hope the wind is blowing the other way. John Barrymore, the great profile with a not-so-great smell. They called him the Great Profile. Stage legend, screen icon, the face that defined elegance in early Hollywood. John Barrymore had Shakespeare in his bones and liquor in his bloodstream. But as his star burned hot and then burned out, something else started to take over, a reputation for being breathtakingly unhygienic. In his prime, Barrymore was polished, suave, sophisticated. But as his career slid into decline, so did his attention to basics like bathing, shaving, or wearing clothes that hadn't been crumpled on the floor. Friends and co-stars described a man who sometimes looked and smelled like he'd slept in an alley behind the studio. And that's because on some nights, he practically had. He was a master of Shakespeare, but a disaster in the dressing room. Wardrobe often had to double as laundry service because he'd wear the same shirt for days. His breath was said to be an unholy mix of stale gin, cigars, and tooth decay. And while his booming voice still commanded attention, being within arm's reach could bring tears to your eyes for all the wrong reasons. His habits got weirder as he aged. He'd forget to change clothes, forget to eat, forget to clean himself, sometimes in that order. Once, he reportedly passed out in full costume and came back the next day still wearing it and still reeking of the night before. But here's the maddening part, he still had it. That magnetic pull, that flash of brilliance. Even when he was hungover, unshaven, and barely upright, when the director called action, Barrymore could summon something transcendent. Just don't hug him after. Fatty Arbuckle, the slapstick star who skipped the soap. Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle was one of the very first kings of Hollywood. Before Chaplin ruled silent comedy, before the studios had their golden age, Fatty was already a household name. A genius with physical comedy, he moved like a man half his size and twice as clever. But off-screen, Arbuckle was less ha-ha funny and more oh-no gross. He lived big, ate big, drank big, and unfortunately sweated huge. His hygiene, or lack of it, was the stuff of early studio legend. Colleagues joked that Fatty didn't believe in soap, and based on the evidence, they weren't kidding. He was known to wear the same stretched-out undergarments for days, even in sweltering heat, and would change shirts only when someone physically handed him a fresh one, and sometimes not even then. He'd spend long shoe days in wool suits soaked with sweat, makeup, and leftover lunch, then reportedly toss them in a corner at night and put them right back on the next morning. Assistants dreaded handling his wardrobe. His breath? A pungent blend of cheap booze, cigars, and whatever had been stuck in his teeth since breakfast. And the worst part, he didn't seem to notice or care. Arbuckle threw parties that became infamous, wild, indulgent, and deeply unhygienic affairs where the cleanup was never fully done. Guests would leave laughing and occasionally itchy. His home was described by more than one guest as sticky. Not the furniture, the air. Despite it all, Arbuckle remained a sensation until scandals ended his career in a flash. But even before the headlines, those who worked with him knew the real mess wasn't just in the newspapers. It was in the man himself. Richard Burton, the bard of booze and B.O. Richard Burton had the kind of voice that could seduce an audience from across a battlefield or a bar. Shakespearean trained, wildly intelligent, and with enough screen presence to go toe-to-toe with Elizabeth Taylor, on screen and off, Burton was pure firepower. But when it came to hygiene, that same firepower often smelled like it came from a pile of smoldering laundry. Burton drank like it was a job. A full-time, union-protected job. Scotch, whiskey, gin. If it burned going down, he was interested. And with the drinking came the sweating, and with the sweating came, well, let's call it an atmosphere. He was known to roll out of bed still buzzed from a night before, toss on yesterday's clothes, still wrinkled, stained, and reeking, and head straight to set. On more than one occasion, co-stars reported being hit by a wall of booze breath strong enough to peel wallpaper. Elizabeth Taylor, his on-again, off-again everything, was one of the few who could stand to be that close to him, and even she had limits. Makeup artists had to do double duty. not just covering dark circles, but dabbing away the alcohol sweats that clung to his temples like dew on a whiskey barrel. Wardrobe teams sometimes begged him to change shirts midday, not for fashion, but for the rest of the cast's survival. One poor soul from the crew described his trailer as smelling like a pub that hadn't opened its windows since the Blitz. And yet, when he stepped in front of the camera, the grime disappeared. Suddenly, he was a king, a poet, a tortured soul delivered from the gods. That's the maddening part of Richard Burton. He could smell like a storm drain and still deliver lines that made grown men weep. Just don't sit next to him at lunch. James Dean, the rebel who reeked. James Dean wasn't acting, he was the rebel. Brooding, unpredictable, effortlessly magnetic. He had a cigarette in one hand, a philosophy book in the other, and usually a layer of grime clinging to him like a second skin. While fans swooned over his tortured stare and tousled hair, those who worked with him got something extra, the full experience of a man who truly didn't give a damn about Hollywood, expectations, or soap. Dean had zero interest in looking polished. He wore the same clothes for days, faded jeans, greased-up boots, and that iconic red jacket, which, according to insiders, started to smell more like Rebel without a rinse as filming went on. He'd sleep in his car, nap backstage, or crash on a friend's couch, and never once worry about where the nearest shower was. Makeup artists said his face was often oily, his nails were black with whatever engine he'd been elbow-deep in, and his breath carried the unmistakable tang of cigarettes, diner coffee, and leftover cheeseburger. He'd walk onto set looking like he'd rolled through a mechanic's garage, and he had. Dean was obsessed with cars and motorcycles, and his love of grease extended well beyond the garage floor and into his personal hygiene routine, or lack of one. He hated being touched up, brushed off, or cleaned up for close-ups. He wanted to look real. And unfortunately for his co-stars, that included smelling real too. But when the camera rolled, none of it mattered. He had that thing. That intangible force that made the dirt, the sweat, the stink, all of it, part of the myth. James Dean didn't try to be iconic. He just was, even if he smelled like gasoline and last night's diner. William Holden, the golden boy with a funk. William Holden had the looks of a matinee idol and the grit of a war correspondent. Ruggedly handsome, Oscar-winning, and utterly magnetic, he was one of Hollywood's most bankable stars. But behind the steely stare and leading man charm was a man who frequently smelled like he'd just crawled out of a bottle, and sometimes he had. Holden was a legendary drinker, even by mid-century Hollywood standards. And with the drinking came the slip-ups, showing up late, disheveled, still wearing the same shirt from yesterday, and reeking of a hangover that hit before he even opened his mouth. His natural musk, combined with the haze of cigarette smoke and stale bourbon, created an odor cocktail his co-stars never quite got used to. There were stories of makeup crews having to powder him not just for shine, but for scent. One co-star said it felt like working next to a whiskey barrel that occasionally forgot its lines. Wardrobe often had to swap out his clothes midday, not for fashion continuity, but because they were soaked through with sweat, booze, and whatever late-night chaos he'd survived. Still, Holden never lost that slow-burn charisma. Even at his worst, he could nail a take and leave audiences breathless. But anyone standing near him? They were just trying to breathe through their nose as little as possible. Charles Bronson, the silent type. Until the smell hit, Charles Bronson didn't say much on screen, and even less off it. He was the strong, silent type. The man you didn't mess with. But one thing about Bronson spoke volumes without saying a word: his smell. Known for his no-nonsense demeanor and total disregard for Hollywood fluff, Bronson took a similar approach to hygiene. There are accounts from crew members saying he would show up to work in the same clothes multiple days in a row, often with dirt still on them from wherever he'd been hiding out between shoots. He didn't believe in fussing with grooming, and it showed. He wasn't overtly dirty, just unkempt. A bit sour. The kind of guy who smelled like he'd been chopping wood all morning, skipped the shower, and came straight to set. He believed in hard work, not cologne. And that leathery sun-baked skin? It wasn't bronzer. It was just the result of never moisturizing and always being outside. Bronson had an energy that kept people at arm's length. Which was helpful because that's about how far you needed to stand to avoid catching a whiff of his method authenticity. He didn't care what you thought of him, and he certainly didn't care what you smelled. But when he glared into the lens, none of that mattered. Because when Charles Bronson was in the frame, nobody dared complain. James Cagney, the tough guy who sweated style. James Cagney was electric, fast-talking, fist-swinging, toe-tapping charm wrapped in a 5'7" frame of pure intensity. He danced like lightning and punched like a freight train. But what most fans don't know is that Cagney sweated like he was running a marathon in a wool suit. Every single day. Cagney brought such ferocity to his performances that his costumes were often soaked within the first hour. Multiple directors noted they had to shoot his close-ups first before the sweat fully took over. His shirts would cling to him, and wardrobe would sometimes prep 2 or 3 duplicates per scene just to keep up with his on-set perspiration. And the smell? Well, it came with the territory. Crew members remembered the mix of stage makeup, old-school pomade, and body heat as memorable. Not offensive, just dense. The kind of humidity you felt before you smelled. He wasn't dirty. He was just a human pressure cooker. The kind of guy who worked so hard, his body rejected the idea of staying dry. And back then, they didn't exactly have cooling fans or sweat-wicking fabric. You were expected to soak through it and keep delivering, which he did. Every time. Whether he was slapping a gangster or gliding across a dance floor, Cagney gave it everything, even if it meant giving off a little too much body heat in the process. They were legends. Icons. Flawed human beings who helped shape the golden age of cinema, while carrying habits that remind us just how real, raw, and unfiltered even the biggest stars can be. Behind every red carpet and spotlight was a person, sometimes messy, sometimes troubled, but always unforgettable. In the end, their legacies aren't defined by the smell they left behind, but by the impact they made on screen. If you enjoyed peeling back the curtain on old Hollywood's untold truths, don't forget to subscribe. There's more where this came from, more myths to unravel, more legends to explore. And trust me, it only gets stranger from here. Thanks for watching.